If you've ever set foot in Montana during mid-January, you'd understand why they call it the land of wind and memory. The wind here doesn't just pass through, it lingers like a silent sentinel, brushing against old recollections. It lashes your soul with fragments of the past, reopens scars you thought had healed, and sometimes, if you stand still long enough, it whispers the names of those who are no longer here. And somewhere, in a forgotten corner of southern Montana, a speck on the map, barely worth the ink, lived a man haunted by the ghosts of his own making. Jonas Flint was no longer the man he used to be. 20 years as a firefighter had worn down his back, but nothing had scorched his soul like the night 5 years ago, the night he lost his wife and little girl in a fire that never had a clear answer. They said it was a gas leak. He didn't listen. All he remembered was his wife's scream, and the image of little Hazel clutching a half-burnt toy horse in her tiny arms. Since then, Flint Ranch, once a proud training ground for racing horses, where his daughter had first learned to ride, had gone quiet. The stables now housed only 3 aging horses: Chester, a toothless draft gelding; Mabel, a half-blind mare with a twitchy gait; and an old swayback gelding who only walked right on sunny days. Jonas cared for them not out of love, but because there was no one else left to care for. He lived alone. No smartphone. No internet. A hand-cranked radio was his only thread to the outside world. The only thing that still worked at the ranch was routine. Wake at 6. Check the fences. Feed the horses. Patch the roof. Drink bitter black coffee. And wait for sunset. That morning was no different. Jonas pulled off one glove to test the air. The cold bit like a blade. He tightened the collar of his wool coat, grabbed the feed bucket, and crunched through the frost-bitten snow. Everything was as it had been until he heard something off. Not the wind. Not the creaking of barn wood. A sound, light, but insistent. Like hoofs tapping old timber. Jonas froze. He turned, eyes scanning the eastern fence line, the border where his property met the federal nature reserve. And he saw it. A horse. Standing motionless in the fog. No saddle. No halter. Its gray coat melted into the colorless morning, save for a single black stripe that ran down its spine like a blade from neck to tail. Its eyes, deep, black, unreadable, weren't watching its surroundings. They were fixed on him. Jonas stopped cold. Wild horses didn't approach people. They avoided humans like plague. But this one stood just a few feet from the fence. Unafraid. Unmoving. Lost your way, boy? Jonas muttered, more to himself than to the animal. But then he shivered. Because the horse nodded. Not a twitch. Not a random bob. A deliberate, slow nod. Jonas wasn't one to hallucinate. He'd seen fire explode from fuel-soaked floors, watched teammates collapse in smoke, stared into the lifeless eyes of the charred. But never, not once, had a wild horse looked at him like this. He took a step toward the fence. The horse didn't flinch. Another step. The wind howled louder. The animal stepped back slightly, not out of fear, but as if making space. Then, it raised a hoof and tapped the frozen earth. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then it lifted its head and turned east, toward the snow-covered foothills rising from the plains. Jonas narrowed his eyes. He knew that direction. Beyond that ridge, the ranch gave way to sparse forest and then to the wilderness of federal lands. No trails. No cabins. No sane soul would wander there in winter. The horse looked back again. This time, it snorted, a short, urgent breath, as if urging him. No way in hell. Jonas stepped back. The scent of burning filled his mind. His wife's face. Hazel's laughter mixed with the neigh of a toy horse. Then silence. Ashes. But the horse didn't leave. It turned toward the hills, took a few steps, then stopped. Turned. Watched. Waiting. For the first time in years, Jonas felt something stir. Not pain. Not habit. Something else. Something strange. As if fate had exhaled gently against the back of his neck and whispered, "Go." He tightened the strap of his cap. It was bitter cold. But it had been even longer since he'd walked out of the shadow he'd been hiding in. He turned toward the barn, grabbed a bridle, and saddled up Chester, the oldest horse he still trusted to carry him. Mounting up, he looked toward where the wild horse stood waiting. He didn't know where he was going. But he knew one thing. That morning, the wind carried more than cold. It carried a message. From the other side of the fence. From a creature that couldn't speak, but might understand more than most people ever would. And so Jonas Flint, the man who had lost everything, set off into a story he didn't yet know, one that would make sure he would never be the same again. He didn't know the horse's name. Not yet. But one day, he would call him Ashes, because sometimes, the fire begins again, in what we thought was only dust. As Jonas stepped over the eastern fence line, the air seemed to grow thicker, like he wasn't just crossing into another patch of land, but stepping between two worlds. One of human routine, predictable and worn. And the other, wild, wordless, ruled by instinct and full of mysteries the civilized mind had long forgotten. Ashes led the way, gliding through the snow with the quiet grace of smoke, just like the name Jonas would give him someday. The wild stallion left a winding trail of hoofprints in the untouched snow, but never looked back. He didn't need to. He knew Jonas was following. And Jonas, though unsure why, tightened the reins on Chester and pressed forward, drawn by some invisible thread pulling him into the unknown. The wind picked up as they left the flatlands behind, climbing into a ridge of gentle, snow-covered slopes. Jagged rocks jutted up like the spines of ancient beasts buried just beneath the frost. For the first time in years, Jonas felt something different stir in his chest, not pain, not grief, but awareness. Each step pulled him further away from the ghost of the man he had become and closer to something unnamed. Chester, though old and slow, followed without complaint. Jonas didn't rush. Neither did Ashes. It was a strange journey, no words, no maps, only glances and instincts. And maybe that's what made it feel so real, so raw it tightened his throat. An hour passed, maybe more. The sun hung low now, just a smear of orange behind the haze. Then Ashes stopped abruptly. Jonas reined in Chester and looked ahead. Before them loomed a steep slope, its icy base scattered with loose rocks and slick snow. Ashes turned and looked at Jonas. This time, there was something unmistakable in the stallion's gaze, a plea. "You sure about this?" Jonas rasped. Ashes didn't answer. He just began to climb. Jonas exhaled hard, tightened the saddlebags, and nudged Chester forward. The old gelding snorted but didn't resist. He trusted Jonas, just as Jonas, somehow, had begun to trust Ashes. They crested the ridge as dusk began swallowing the sky. Orange light spilled across the snow, glowing against stone and wrinkles alike. Ashes paused at the top, scanning the deep ravine that yawned below, black and bottomless, like the throat of another world. Jonas dismounted, leading Chester slowly down the narrow, winding path. The wind here was different. It howled in long, eerie gusts through the rocks. The air was void of sound, like the world had been muted. Then, through that hollow silence, Jonas heard it, a sound no man who'd worked with horses could mistake, broken, ragged, painful. A mare's cry. He quickened his pace. When he reached the bottom of the ravine, his heart clenched tight. There, crumpled on the damp earth, lay a jet-black mare. Her coat shimmered with sweat and grime, flanks heaving with strained breaths. Her eyes were half shut, legs twitching weakly. Ashes stepped closer, nudged her neck gently, and let out a low, aching whinny. Jonas knelt beside her. It had been years since he'd helped a mare give birth, but the instincts came rushing back. He ran a hand over her belly, feeling the unnatural tension. A spasm shook her body. She was in labor, and something was wrong. If no one helped, she and the foal wouldn't make it. "Ember," he whispered, the name rising unbidden from his lips. "You're the ember in the ashes, aren't you?" Ashes stood just behind him now, close enough for Jonas to hear the rhythm of his anxious breath. The wild stallion, a creature born to flee from men, now stood beside one, eyes locked on every movement, like he was entrusting Jonas with everything he had left. No phone signal. No medical tools. Just two hands that had once pulled people from fire, now trying to pull life from the edge of death. Jonas shrugged off his coat, laying it down to make a clean surface. Then, with utmost care, he placed his hands on Ember's flank. As the next contraction came, he saw a tiny hoof emerge, but it was a rear hoof. A breech birth. He closed his eyes, drawing on every lesson he could recall. His hand slipped into the birth canal, feeling for the other leg. It was bent backward, blocking the way. Ember groaned, but didn't resist, as if she understood that this man was trying to save her, not hurt her. The wind moaned through the rocks like the earth itself holding its breath. Jonas could hear nothing but his heartbeat and Ash's shallow exhale. Then, slowly, with delicate precision, he eased the leg forward. Another contraction hit. Jonas held gently, pulling in rhythm. Hoof, joint, flank, shoulders, head. A small, lifeless body slid out, cradled on the coat beneath it. The foal didn't move. Jonas wiped the nostrils and mouth, then began rubbing the wet, still form with firm, brisk motions. "Come on, baby. Come on, don't give up." He whispered it over and over, as if the words alone could call a soul into being. Then, a twitch. A breath. And a trembling, high-pitched whinny, like the first sound ever spoken in the world. Ember lifted her head. Ashes reared slightly, letting out a powerful call, his first real voice since meeting Jonas. The foal, as black as her mother, raised her head, blinking wide, bewildered eyes. Jonas sat still, one hand resting on the foal's chest. In that moment, something inside him began to lift, something he thought had burned to dust in the fire all those years ago. He turned to Ashes and nodded. "You did the impossible, buddy," he murmured. "You trusted a human. And now, because of that, a new life begins." Above them, snow began to fall, soft and silent, like a blessing whispered by the earth itself. Snowflakes drifted through the narrow ravine like ghostly messengers, silent and weightless, falling on Ember's trembling body. Jonas knelt beside her, breath pluming in the frigid air, eyes locked on the tiny black foal lying motionless on the makeshift bedding of his coat. The silence was deafening. She wasn't moving. Jonas pressed his hands against the foal's damp chest. No breath. No twitch. Just cold. His fingers moved to the nostrils, blocked. He quickly cleared them, wiping away the afterbirth, then began to rub her small frame with both hands, firm and fast. "Come on," he whispered. "Come on, little one. Stay with us." Ashes stood just a few feet away, nostrils flaring, body tense. Every instinct in the stallion's blood must have been screaming at him to flee, to escape the closeness of a man, the smell of blood, the weight of vulnerability. But he didn't. He stayed. Watching. Waiting. Ember gave a guttural sound, half groan, half whimper, and tried to rise, but her legs buckled beneath her. Jonas placed a steadying hand on her neck. "Easy, girl," he murmured. "You've done your part. Let me finish mine." He kept rubbing the foal, heart pounding with the rhythm of old nightmares, the fire, Hazel, that godforsaken silence after the screaming had stopped. This was too familiar. Too close. He didn't think he could do this again. He wasn't a vet. He wasn't even sure who he was anymore. But he couldn't let this life slip away. Not again. Then, a twitch. Barely more than a tremor in the foal's back leg. Jonas froze. Then came a shallow gasp. A sudden rise of the tiny chest. The foal coughed. Jonas let out a strangled breath, half laugh, half sob. "There you go," he whispered, as the foal blinked and turned her head, confused and blinking into the swirling snow. Ember gave a weak whinny and, with great effort, managed to push herself into a sitting position. Her eyes found the foal. Jonas stepped back as she dragged herself closer and began to lick the wet fur, slow and trembling but determined. Ashes let out a soft rumble, something between a sigh and a song, and stepped forward. He lowered his head toward Jonas. And then he did something no wild stallion should ever do. He nodded. A simple, deliberate dip of the head. Not aggressive. Not fearful. A gesture of recognition. Of thanks. Jonas stared at him, too stunned to move. Then he nodded back. "You're welcome." He dropped to his knees, not from weakness, but from something deeper, a kind of surrender. To the moment. To the impossible. To the truth that somewhere between fire and frost, between grief and instinct, something had shifted. It had taken 45 minutes. 45 agonizing, bone-chilling minutes of pain, blood, doubt, and instinct. And now, a new life lay curled in the snow, nuzzling against her mother. Her coat was jet black, but along her forehead, right between her eyes, was a faint flicker of white. A flash. A spark. "Flicker," Jonas said aloud, voice thick with emotion. "That's your name." Ember licked the foal's neck. Flicker let out a high-pitched bleat, legs kicking weakly. "You're gonna be all right," Jonas told her, more to himself than to her. "You're gonna be just fine." Snow began falling heavier now, swirling around the trio like a curtain of silence drawn over a sacred moment. Jonas stood and looked around the ravine. No one else would ever see this place the way he just had. Not on a map. Not in a photograph. This wasn't a location. This was a moment. A bridge between the broken man he had been and the man who had just helped deliver hope back into the world. He gathered his coat from beneath Flicker, now slick and stained but warm with purpose. He left the coat near Ember, who lay curled around her foal like a living shelter, eyes finally beginning to close. Ashes stood watch, his body rigid with alertness. But when Jonas moved toward Chester and the saddlebag, the stallion didn't flinch. He simply stepped to the side, creating space. Jonas pulled out the emergency blanket he'd packed out of habit, spread it over Ember and Flicker, and gave the mare one last look. "You saved her," he said softly, eyes on Ashes. And you didn't run. Ashes didn't respond. He didn't need to. Somewhere high above, a hawk screeched, slicing through the stillness. Jonas turned his face upward. The storm was coming in fast. They had maybe an hour before the path out became a whiteout. He saddled Chester and walked him a few steps up the trail, then turned back. "I'll be back," he called into the ravine. "I swear it." Ember didn't move, but her ears twitched. Ashes lifted his head. Jonas nodded, and then mounted Chester. The old horse snorted but held steady. Step by step, they made their way back up the ravine, the wind now slicing in sheets across the snow. But something in Jonas had changed. Not just because of the birth. Not just because a foal had lived. Because for the first time in 5 years, he'd risked hope again. And hope, when held against the cold, burns hotter than fire. Snow fell relentlessly through the night. The wind howled against the cliffs like echoes of a past that hadn't yet found peace. Jonas and Chester returned to the ranch in silence. The lantern on the barn roof flickered dimly through the blowing snow, but no one called out. No one waited. Only the sound of the old horse panting, and Jonas's hands, numb and stinging from the cold. He didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Flicker's gaze, wide, innocent, unsure. He saw Ashes nod. He saw Ember stretch toward her foal, using what seemed like her last breath to pass on life. For the first time in years, Jonas's heart wasn't heavy with grief, but with something far more fragile, responsibility. By dawn, he saddled Chester again. Not for work, but to return. To keep his promise. To not walk away. The sky was thick with gray. Snow still drifted down in thin flakes. The path up the ridge was nearly buried, but Jonas remembered every branch, every rise. Ashes had taught him how to read the way forward, by feel, not sight. When he reached the bottom of the ravine, he stopped in his tracks. They were still there. Ember lay curled on her side, head resting against her foal. Both were wrapped beneath the emergency blanket Jonas had left behind. And Ashes, unmoving. Still standing watch. Still guarding. Jonas moved in slowly. When he was about 10 paces away, Ashes turned his head to look at him. No nod. No retreat. Just a look. "I came back," Jonas said softly. "Just like I said I would." He knelt to check on Ember. She was breathing, though weaker now. But Flicker, eyes fully open, was trying to stand, wobbling on unsteady legs. "My strong girl," Jonas whispered with a grin. "You're not just gonna live, you're gonna run." He had brought a sack of oats, warm water, and a few sugar cubes. Ember didn't eat much, but she licked her lips, and that was enough for now. Jonas stayed with them through the morning. The wind had calmed, and the sun began to shine through the blanket of clouds. By noon, Jonas stood and dusted the snow from his coat. "I'll be back tomorrow," he told them. "If she's stronger, I'll try to bring all 3 of you home." Ashes seemed to understand. This time, as Jonas turned away, the stallion followed a few steps before stopping. He no longer watched Jonas like a stranger. He stood like a sentinel, another guardian of the wild frontier between man and nature. When Jonas returned to the ranch, he did something he hadn't done in 5 years. He opened the drawer and pulled out an old photo of Hazel on her first ride. She was laughing, arms wrapped around the neck of a gray foal. Jonas set the photo on the table, facing the window that looked toward the canyon. And he whispered, "I'm learning to believe again, Hazel." Because of a wild horse. And a little flicker of light. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The roar of rotor blades thundered across the gray sky like the scream of something cold and merciless. That morning, not a single soul in the federal lands slept peacefully. Birds exploded from low thickets in a panic. Deer darted across frozen creeks, sensing a danger descending from above. But the target wasn't deer. It was horses. A helicopter from the Bureau of Land Management swooped low over the ridgelines, its rotating blades slicing the air. On the ground, mounted wranglers rode fast, dragging portable fencing and tossing nets. It was a roundup, government-sanctioned, legal, scheduled. They said it was for land management. For ecosystem balance. But to Ashes, it was sanctioned slaughter. The wild stallion sensed something wrong at dawn. As Flicker pressed against her mother's side in the bitter cold, and Ember lay breathing faintly near the old stone, Ashes lifted his head toward the sky, and he knew. Something wasn't right. The wind didn't carry the scent of snow. It carried the metallic grind of machines. And the promise of nothing good. When the helicopter crested the horizon, the valley erupted. Other wild horses were flushed out of the timber, driven into open ground. Some scattered, slipping on ice. Others were funneled into a temporary pen of portable fencing. Ember tried to rise, but she was too weak. Flicker whinnied in panic. As the wranglers began closing in, Ashes threw himself between them, shielding mother and foal with his own body. It was no use. A rope looped Ember's neck. Another snared Flicker's small frame. The thundering rotor drowned every cry. Ashes reared and struck out at a rider, only to be driven back by a shocking prod. Ember's final, desperate whinny tore through the air like a blade through earth. Then, metal doors slammed shut. That afternoon, Jonas was hammering shingles back onto the barn roof when he heard it, hooves on old wood. 1, 2, 3, and silence. He looked up. There, dusted in snow and shivering in the cold, was Ashes. No whinny. No fear. Just those black eyes, solid as stone, staring straight into Jonas, as if saying, "They took them. I need you." Again. Jonas stood frozen. He had heard the roundups were coming. People had talked about them on the radio. But he hadn't expected it to be so soon. He hadn't expected to feel like something inside him had been torn out when he saw Ashes standing there, trembling, but still brave enough to defy every instinct and come back to the house of a man. What happened? Jonas rasped, though he already knew. Ashes turned his head toward the mountains. Then back to Jonas. Once again, he tapped his hoof 3 times. Then waited. Jonas pulled off his gloves and stepped off the porch. "All right," he muttered. "All right, partner. Let's go find them." The trip to the roundup site took longer than Jonas expected. Nearly 3 hours on rugged trail before he reached the dirt road where the temporary holding pens had been set up. Trucks, fences, and federal agents formed a perimeter around the clearing. Whinnies echoed through the icy air. Jonas recognized one instantly. Flicker. And Ember. Still alive. Ashes couldn't come with him into the compound. Jonas tied him gently to a tree on the forest's edge, not with rope, but with an old wool scarf. Then he walked in, face calm, boots muddy like any other Montana rancher. When he reached the operations tent, he took a steadying breath and spoke. "I think you've got 3 of mine," escaped the fence and wandered into public land. Black mare, young filly with a white star on her forehead, and a dun stallion with a black dorsal stripe. They're not wild. They're fence breakers. I've got papers. The supervisor, middle-aged, hard eyes, unreadable face, nodded. Can you prove it? Jonas handed him 3 weathered pages. Old registration forms from his father's day. A few grainy photos printed from his phone. 1 handwritten note from the night before. My horses spooked and broke out during the storm on the 11th. The man stared at Jonas for a long moment. Then turned to his assistant. Take him to pen 4. If they match, he can sign them out. Pen 4. Where Jonas saw Ember, leaning against the cold steel panels, and Flicker, trembling, huddled at her side. Still breathing. Still alive. Ember, Jonas whispered. She turned her head. Blinked. When Jonas signed the papers, his hand shook. He knew, if caught, it was a federal offense. But he also knew this: if he didn't sign, they'd be taken. Shipped to holding. Auctioned off. Or worse. Ashes was brought out last. As the handler approached with the stallion, he paused. You sure about this? This one's wild. No chip. No brand. Jonas met Ash's eyes. The stallion stood still. No fight. No fear. I'm sure. He's mine. His name is Ashes. That evening, 3 souls climbed into Jonas's trailer and made the long ride back to Flint Ranch. No one saw. No one asked. But Jonas didn't feel relief. All the way home, he listened to the wind outside the windows. And once, just once, he turned to Ashes and whispered, I don't know if I did the right thing. But I know this: if I hadn't done it, I'd never forgive myself. Ashes didn't nod. He didn't whinny. But one ear tilted slightly toward Jonas. And that was enough. From that day on, Jonas understood, sometimes, the right thing isn't legal. It's the thing that makes a wild creature come back to your door. And a broken man break the rules. Because some things are worth living for. The crescent moon hung above the silent pines as Jonas quietly unlatched the southern gate of Flint Ranch. That gate opened toward the wild expanse, where the land of men ended and the domain of the untamed began. In Jonas's hand was a small hurricane lantern, its warm yellow light flickering against the deep lines of his weathered face. In front of him, Ashes stood still as stone, his eyes never leaving the gate that had just swung open. You don't owe me anything, Jonas said, his voice low and steady. I'm not locking you in. There's no stall. No reins. No fences. You're free to go, Ashes. You're free. The night wind threaded through the canyons, sharp as bone, carrying with it a silence that seemed heavier than cold. Ember and Flicker slept behind the barn, finally at peace after days of chaos. Jonas didn't look at them. He only looked at Ashes. The wild horse took a long breath. Once. Then again. He turned his head slowly toward the distant darkness, the forest melting into prairie, where instinct had whispered to him since the day he was born. Jonas stepped back, placing one hand over his chest. I once lost everything, he said softly, because I tried to hold on to what was never mine to keep. This time, I won't make the same mistake. The choice is yours. No one urged him forward. No one blocked the path. Ashes stood motionless, then slowly began to walk toward the open gate. One step. Then another. Solid. Measured. Jonas didn't call after him. He didn't try to stop him. And then, without a sound, Ashes crossed the boundary of Flint Ranch and vanished into the silver fog of night. Jonas stood there long after the horse had disappeared. Something inside him unraveled. Not grief. Not loss. But a kind of quiet acceptance, like finally understanding that some wings are meant for sky. He turned off the lantern and returned to the barn, but didn't go inside. All night, he sat on the porch, hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee, eyes fixed on the open gate, waiting for something he couldn't name. Winter dawns in Montana come slow. The first light filtered through brittle leaves like a dream nearing its end. Jonas dozed beneath a thin blanket wrapped loosely around his shoulders. The soft snort of a horse stirred him. He lifted his head. There, beyond the light mist, standing just outside the fence, not inside, not crossing the boundary, was Ashes. He stood tall, ears pointed toward the barn. His gaze fixed inside, where Ember was licking Flicker's neck after a cold night. He didn't whinny. Didn't approach. Just stood quietly, like a father waiting at the schoolyard gate, as if accepting something more complicated than leaving or staying, a kind of conditional freedom. Jonas rose, his shoulders heavy from a sleepless night. He stepped outside, slowly approaching the fence. "Yesterday I let you go," he said gently. "Today, you chose to stay close." Ashes looked at him. No nod. No retreat. Just that deep, quiet gaze, as if to say, "I won't leave them alone. But I'm still my own." That day, Jonas didn't close the gate. Nor did he open it wider. He left it ajar, just enough to be an invitation, not a command. Ashes didn't enter. But he didn't walk away either. For the next week, every morning, Jonas found Ashes in the same place. Standing watch. Observing. Always outside the fence, but never too far. Whenever Jonas let Ember and Flicker roam the pasture, Ashes would follow along the fence line, occasionally pausing when Flicker let out a playful whinny. One afternoon, Flicker slipped through the gate that had never been shut. She limped toward Ashes on still wobbly legs. Jonas startled to his feet. But Ashes didn't move. He let the filly press her head against his neck, then gently nudged her back toward the barn with his muzzle. And Flicker, understanding, somehow turned and returned. That night, for the first time in many years, Jonas wrote in a journal. Freedom isn't being able to go anywhere. It's knowing where you belong and still choosing to stay. Jonas began restoring the Old North stable. Not tall. Not enclosed. Just a simple shelter with a roof, clean straw, and a door left open. He wasn't building it to keep Ashes in. Just, in case, one day, the wild got too heavy, and the horse needed a place to rest. One snowy morning, while carrying oats to the barn, Jonas noticed new hoof prints pressed into the soft white layer. They were deep and wide, not Chester's, not Ember's. The tracks led from the edge of the forest to the door of the Old North stable. And stopped there. Ashes wasn't inside when Jonas arrived. But the prints said enough. He had entered. Not to stay. But to check. To make sure that if the wild ever wore him down, Flint Ranch would still be home. That evening, as the sun sank red behind the ridgeline like burning coals, Jonas stood on the porch, a warm mug in hand, eyes scanning the tree line where Ashes usually waited. He didn't see him. But he didn't worry. Because he knew that come morning, when he stepped outside, a familiar silhouette would be there, just beyond the fence. Not caged. Not owned. But never far. And for Jonas, that was enough. 3 weeks after Ashes chose to remain near the fence rather than disappear into the wild, Jonas received an unexpected letter. Not a handwritten note, but an email printed from the town library. The sender, Dr. Mara Caldwell, an ecologist and wild animal behaviorist working at a research institute in Colorado. Her message was brief but filled with excitement. She had read about the wild horse who knocked on a door through a viral social media post, and she wanted to meet Jonas as soon as possible. Jonas didn't like crowds. He trusted the internet even less. But something in the way the woman wrote made him pause. Phrases like non-instinctual behavior, interspecies emotional bonding, and voluntary herd-human integration were strange to him. But somehow, they rang true. 4 days later, a silver SUV pulled up at the dusty trail leading into Flint Ranch. A tall, lean woman stepped out. Her silver-streaked hair peeked out beneath a worn canvas cap. She wore a waxed jacket and had the alert, clear gaze of someone who had spent a lifetime observing the silent language of animals. "Mr. Flint? I'm Mara Caldwell. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Jonas nodded. He wasn't one for small talk. But Mara didn't seem to mind. She walked slowly around the ranch, observing in silence. Asked a few short questions about Ember, Flicker, and Ashes. Then, as they sat on the porch with steaming mugs of tea, she set hers down and looked out toward the distant fence. "That stallion, Ashes, he's not behaving like a wild horse. Not entirely. He's something in between. A being that has moved beyond pure instinct, yet remains untamed. I've heard of cases like this, but they're exceedingly rare." Jonas responded quietly. "He came on his own. I just didn't send him away." Mara nodded. "And that's the critical part. You didn't try to break him. You didn't interfere. You let him choose." Their conversation stretched over 2 hours. Mara took notes the whole time, occasionally asking detailed questions about Ash's reactions when Flicker was injured or when Jonas had opened the gate. She became visibly moved as Jonas recounted the night of the difficult birth in the snow and blood. Finally, she sighed. "I've been in research for nearly 25 years, and I've never seen a case so clear of voluntary emotional bonding between a wild Mustang and a human. If I propose a pilot model to the government, would you be interested in taking part?" Jonas blinked, surprised. "Taking part in what?" "A sanctuary. Right here. On this land. But not a holding facility. Not a zoo. A space where wild horses can live semi-freely, with a human presence they've accepted. No ropes. No cages. Just trust. You're the first person I've seen who could truly manage that." Jonas didn't answer right away. But as he glanced toward Ashes, still standing silently at the fence as he did every morning, his silence became its own kind of yes. A month later, the pilot program was approved. Flint Ranch was officially renamed Flint Meadows Family Mustang Sanctuary, the first of its kind. Jonas was appointed experimental manager under a 3-year contract with infrastructure and maintenance funding. There were no red ribbons. No press coverage. Just a hand-carved wooden sign hanging at the entrance. Flint Meadows, where horses choose to stay. Ashes was the first to step through the gate, not pulled, not prodded. Just walked in. Jonas stood beside him, silent. But in his heart bloomed something quiet and deep, like the morning he first heard Flicker's breath, weak but alive. And then, strange things began to happen. Other wild horses, from nearby forests, from far-off valleys, began appearing near the fences. First 1, then 3, then small groups of 5 or 6, watching the area where Ashes and his family now roamed. No one herded them. No one chased them in. Jonas just left the gate open, as he always had. And slowly, one by one, they entered. Jonas became part of a world that didn't speak with words. Every morning, he walked the sanctuary's borders, carrying a bucket of oats and a deep, warm voice. He didn't call the horses by name. He didn't command. He just spoke, as if greeting old friends. "Good morning, folks." The horses, initially wary, began to come closer. A young brown colt named Smoke was the first to press his nose against Jonas's weathered palm. Then came Lily, a white mare with a coat like winter frost, who allowed Jonas to remove a thorn from her front leg. No neighs. No fear. Only silence and trust built on presence, not pressure. The media started to notice. A small local article described the first semi-free Mustang sanctuary managed by a lone rancher. Then came a TV feature. Then documentary filmmakers. Ecology students. But Jonas only agreed to speak with those who genuinely cared about the horses, not just clicks and camera angles. One day, a red-haired, freckled boy on a tour stood by the fence and asked, "Don't they ever run away?" Jonas smiled. If they run, it's because they need the wind. But if they come back, it's because someone's still waiting. Ashes no longer waited outside the fence. He now lived with the herd, but maintained a quiet distance from humans. Still, every time Jonas stepped out of the cabin, Ashes would lift his head, ears perked, as if listening. Once, when Flicker slipped into a muddy ditch, Ashes was the first to whinny, a sharp, urgent call, and didn't take his eyes off her until Jonas arrived and lifted her out. "He's the watchtower," Jonas said to Mara during a routine check-in. "Not the leader, but the one the herd looks to when they need direction." Mara nodded. "And you're the one Ashes looks to remember why he stayed." A month later, the government announced plans to expand the family Mustang sanctuary model, with Flint Meadows as the flagship. Jonas was invited to speak at a national ecology conference, something he would have laughed at just a few years ago. But this time, he stood before hundreds, voice steady and low. "I'm not an expert. I'm just a man who lost everything, then realized, sometimes, the only thing that can save you from yourself is a wild creature who chooses to trust your eyes." The room fell silent. Then applause. But Jonas didn't smile. He was remembering the first time Ashes tapped his hoof 3 times on the porch wood. The moment he chose to step toward hope rather than away from it. And he knew this sanctuary wasn't built to hold horses in. It was built to give people a reason to keep moving forward. As Flint Meadows grew into its name, something unexpected began to take root alongside the trust and serenity, redemption. It came in the form of broken bodies, tired eyes, and hesitant hooves. Some of the horses that arrived now weren't fully wild. They were the discarded, the wounded, Mustangs from government holding pens that had no hope of adoption. A skewed leg, a cloudy eye, a brand too deep to forget. They came not as free spirits, but as reminders of what the world had cast aside. Jonas didn't turn any of them away. One of the first was a limping gelding with a crooked ear, whom Jonas named Bandit. The horse had been abused, mistrusting of reins, and flinched at every sound. It took weeks before Bandit would accept food without a panicked retreat. "I don't need them perfect," Jonas said to Mara one evening as they leaned against the post near the feeding trough. "I just need them to know they're not alone." Mara had been visiting more often. Officially, she was tracking herd behavior and recording data for the sanctuary program. Unofficially, well, even the wild find comfort in companionship. It was during one of her visits that a truck rolled up the path, a dusty old Chevy carrying more than hay. In the passenger seat was a boy, 10 years old, pale, thin, his eyes locked to the glove compartment as if afraid to meet the world outside. His name was Caleb, the son of Mike Barlow, an old firefighting buddy Jonas hadn't seen in nearly a decade. "He's on the spectrum," Mike explained quietly. "Hasn't spoken in years. Therapy's been hard. Animals seem to calm him, but even that's hit or miss." Jonas looked at the boy, then out to the pasture where Flicker was chasing a butterfly beneath the afternoon sun. "Let him try," he said simply. The first few days, Caleb didn't move from the porch. He sat with his knees to his chest, watching silently as the horses grazed. Jonas didn't push. He just made sure the boy had juice, space, and quiet. Flicker noticed him before anyone else did. The young filly, curious and light as wind, began inching closer each day, never too fast, never direct. She'd graze near the house, swing her head in his direction, flick her ears and tail as if dancing for his gaze. On the 5th morning, Caleb stood. He didn't speak, but he walked, slowly, hands tucked into his sleeves, down the steps and toward Flicker. Jonas watched from a distance, heart in his throat. Flicker didn't spook. She walked the last few feet herself, stretching her nose toward the boy's chest. Caleb froze. Then, very slowly, he lifted a trembling hand. The touch was feather-light. 1 second. 2. Then Flicker bumped her nose against his palm. "Horse," Caleb whispered. The sound was barely more than breath. But Jonas heard it. Mara, standing behind the barn, covered her mouth. Mike dropped the coffee he was holding. "Did he?" "He did," Jonas said, his eyes wet. After that, Caleb returned every day. Sometimes he brought carrots. Sometimes he just sat beside Flicker, humming tunelessly as she dozed in the sun. One afternoon, he turned to Jonas and asked, "Do they remember?" Jonas knelt beside him. "I think they remember everything. But they forgive easier than we do." Mara watched them from the porch. That night, as they walked the fence line together, she said, "You're good with him. I'm just giving him space. That's all." She paused. "It's what you gave Ashes too." They walked in silence for a while. The stars began to bleed through the darkening sky. "You ever think," Mara said finally, "that second chances don't just happen to the animals out here?" Jonas looked at her, the lines on his face softening. "Yeah," he said. "Lately. I think about that a lot." He didn't say what he felt. He didn't need to. Sometimes, a nod shared beneath the moonlight said more than words ever could. Flint Meadows had become more than a sanctuary for horses. It had become a place where the broken came not just to heal, but to begin again. Flint Meadows had just weathered the harshest winter in a decade. Snow fell so thick that the forest along the valley's edge vanished from view for weeks. Wind howled through the canyons like the mourning of the earth itself. And yet, in the midst of that cold siege, quiet miracles continued to unfold. Flicker was fully grown now. Once a trembling foal cradled in Jonas's arms, she had become tall, brave, and swift as the prairie wind. Her jet-black coat gleamed beneath the sun, and the little white star on her forehead had become a symbol that visitors never forgot. She wasn't just part of the herd, she was its soul. Jonas watched her every morning as she galloped across the pasture, playing with the younger colts. He always lingered longer than necessary, eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to memorize every motion. But behind those eyes lived a quiet worry, one he never voiced, yet everyone could sense. Ember, Flicker's mother, was aging. That winter was too much, even for a heart that had once survived a snow-drenched birth. Jonas noticed Ember eating less. Her steps slowed. And one morning, she didn't rise. Ashes was the first to know. When Jonas reached the stable, he found the wild stallion standing motionless beside Ember's still body, a dusting of snow covering her dark coat. Ashes didn't move. All through the night, he had kept vigil, eyes deep as a frozen canyon. Jonas knelt. His hand trembled as he rested it on her now cold side. He didn't cry. But his eyes, dark like ashes, held a mourning as vast as the sky. He didn't call anyone. Didn't dig a grave. Instead, he built a small funeral pyre behind the pasture, right where Ember had once been saved. Jonas wrapped her ashes in a cloth bundle, then, alone, rode Chester up the southern ridge, the very place where he had first met Ashes. The wind was strong up there. But it didn't bite. He opened the bundle and lifted handfuls of soft ash, letting them fall from the cliff's edge. The ash scattered on the breeze, drifting into the ravine below like particles of time. "You lived like fire," he whispered. "And now you return to ash. But your flame, it still burns in your daughter." When he turned, Ashes was waiting. Not close, but close enough to understand, to witness. Jonas didn't speak. He simply nodded. And Ashes, for the first time, stepped forward, resting his forehead gently against Jonas's shoulder. A touch, not possession, but a farewell deeper than words. Months later, Jonas received an invitation to speak at the International Conference on Human-Wildlife Relationships in Geneva. He almost declined. But Mara said something that stayed with him. Sometimes the world needs to hear the truth from someone who's lost everything. So Jonas stood there. On a circular stage in a grand hall, in front of hundreds of scholars, scientists, and people who had never set foot in a barn. He didn't wear a suit. Just an old leather jacket, dusty boots, and a photo of Ember and Flicker tucked inside his notebook. He didn't read a speech. He just spoke. "I used to think I was the hero," he began, his voice low and steady. "I thought that when I saved a horse, I was doing something noble. That I had climbed a fence, entered the wild, and pulled life back from death. I believed I was the one giving a second chance." He paused. The room was silent. "But the truth is, I was the one who was saved. A horse, wild, wordless, irrational, came to my door, tapped his hoof 3 times on my porch, as if asking, 'Do you still believe?'" Jonas took a breath. "I survived fires, loss, and loneliness. But I never truly faced myself, not until a horse placed his trust in me before I could even trust myself." He held up the photo. Her name was Ember. She passed away this winter. But she left behind a daughter named Flicker, and a man who no longer lives inside the shadows of his past. There was no applause at first. People were wiping tears. Then, one clap, then another, the entire room rose to their feet. Jonas didn't bow. He simply turned to the large screen behind him, where a photo showed Flicker running through snow-covered fields, Ashes galloping just behind her. And he whispered, too softly for the mic to catch, "Thank you for teaching me how to love again." Spring arrived with a softness Flint Meadows hadn't felt in years. Snow melted into clear creeks, wildflowers bloomed between fence posts, and the sun returned with the promise of something new. But even as life stirred in the soil and sky, Jonas knew something was preparing to end. Ashes was slowing down. The once proud stallion now moved with deliberate steps. His mane, streaked with silver, fluttered gently in the wind. But what he lacked in speed, he made up for in presence. Each morning, as the dew clung to the grass, Ashes led Flicker, now a mother herself, on a slow, ritual walk around the edges of the ranch. Jonas watched from the porch, coffee in hand. He'd see the two of them in silhouette against the sunrise, Ashes leading with quiet dignity, Flicker trailing close, her own foal prancing beside her. It was a passing of torches, not in ceremony, but in rhythm, in understanding. One afternoon, a letter arrived from D.C. Jonas opened it slowly, the paper crackling beneath his fingers. Inside, a single line made his breath hitch. The sanctuary first bill has passed. The bill, the same one sparked by his story with Ashes, would now establish family-based wild horse sanctuaries across the country. It was law. Jonas sat down hard on the porch steps. Ashes had once broken centuries of instinct to seek help. And now, that choice had changed the nation. He looked out to the pasture, saw Ashes standing beneath the cottonwood tree, ears turning with the breeze. "You did it, old man," Jonas murmured. "You really did it." That night, the sky was unnaturally clear. Stars burned like memories overhead. Jonas couldn't sleep. Something gnawed at his chest, not pain, but something he recognized too well. A kind of knowing. When he stepped outside, the wind had stilled. Ashes was not in the pasture. Jonas's heart pounded. He grabbed a lantern and walked the perimeter. Nothing. No hoof prints. No nicker in the dark. He returned at dawn. And there, just beyond the gate, where wild land kissed sanctuary, stood Ashes. He wasn't inside. He wasn't outside. He was between. Jonas approached slowly. Ashes didn't flinch. He stood tall, proud, but tired. Flicker and her foal watched from the ridge, silent. Jonas reached out. Ashes stepped forward. Their foreheads touched, man and horse, weathered by years in silence. It was not goodbye. It was understanding. Then Ashes turned. Without sound or ceremony, he walked into the rising sun, each step deliberate, each breath steady. He never looked back. Jonas never saw Ashes again. No body. No sign. Only that moment at the gate remained, etched into his soul. There are goodbyes that need no words. And there are touches, quiet, unpromising, that still etch themselves into eternity. Ashes, the wild Mustang who was never tamed, came, saved, and vanished into the wind like a breath of nature itself. But what he left behind wasn't in a barn. It wasn't in the memory of a lonely man. It was in the way Flicker walks each morning, following the invisible hoofprints of her father. We often believe we're the ones saving animals. But sometimes, they are the first to reach out when we're the ones drowning. Freedom isn't just the right to leave. Sometimes, freedom is choosing to stay. For love, for responsibility, for a silent promise. And perhaps, the greatest thing Ashes ever did wasn't breaking through fences to find a man, but giving that man, lost in grief, the courage to open the gate again. The story of the wild Mustang ends here. But if it touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember, healing is real. Tell us in the comments, what moment moved you the most? What did Ashes teach you? And if you believe in stories that honor the bond between humans and animals, like, share, and subscribe to Gallop of Glory so you never miss the next journey. Because somewhere, out there, another hoofbeat is already echoing. For someone who's still waiting to be found. We'll see you in the next story.